On June 16, 1962, the American environmental movement began with a publication containing an excerpt from Rachel Carson's new book, Silent Spring.
This is one of the nation's best sellers, first printed on September 27, 1962. Up to now, 500,000 copies have been sold, and Silent Spring has been called the most controversial book of the year.
Published in a time where DDT could be found in one's food, clothing, homes, and even their bodies, Carson's writing exposed a different side to pesticides, one that caused death and destruction. She chose to forge ahead, despite the fierce opposition she would face, and was able to unite people from all different backgrounds under the banner of protecting the earth. World War II, a bloody, violent battle against the Axis powers, and a hopeless one against disease. As soldiers marched across Europe and Asia, outbreaks of typhus, syphilis, and malaria plagued American infantrymen, weakening their fighting force. Spread by lice, fleas, and mosquitoes, these diseases were almost unstoppable and moved like wildfire among the ranks of soldiers. Desperate for a solution, the military turned to their scientists, who responded with DDT. Dichloral diphenyl trichloroethane, or DDT, was part of a new generation of pesticides that was reportedly safe enough to eat, yet extraordinarily effective against insects. After a series of tests which proved its solubility, longevity, and most importantly, effectiveness, DDT was rushed to the front lines. The effects were stunning. After a typhus outbreak appeared in the crowded Naples, every single resident was dusted with DDT. Within a couple of months, the menace of the epidemic was over. In the Pacific, entire islands were sprayed with chemicals to eliminate disease-carrying mosquitoes. A couple years after pesticides were first introduced to the war, America emerged victorious, armed with the twin weapons of modern science, the atomic bomb and the insect bomb, DDT. Chemists soon synthesized a host of new compounds. By 1957, over 6,000 different insecticide products were available to the public. Eager to display the power of these newfound substances, the U.S. Department of Agriculture announced a campaign to destroy the existence of the red imported fire ant. Around 20 million acres in the South were doused with pesticides, killing not only ants, but countless numbers of birds and rodents that dwelled there. Meanwhile, Rachel Carson, a quiet marine biologist on the shores of Maine, was beginning to have concerns over this increasingly aggressive method of pest control. During her time working at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, she had published a trilogy about the sea, which highlighted the powerful and concrete nature of the earth. However, Carson was beginning to notice that the birds and fish she loved so dearly were slowly dying off. As she began to investigate further, Carson realized that, while DDT didn't seem to be acutely toxic, the long-term environmental impacts could be devastating. She saw that pesticides like DDT accumulated and grew even more concentrated as they moved up the food chain through a process called biomagnification, and found evidence to suggest that insects were developing a resistance to pesticides. She later wrote to her friend, Dorothy Freeman, "The more I learned about the use of pesticides, the more appalled I became. I realized that here was the material for a book. What I discovered was that everything which meant the most to me as a naturalist was being threatened, and that nothing I could do would be more important." As she continued writing, Carson became increasingly aware of the amount of resistance she would have to face. By the late 1950s, after multiple eradication campaigns, a close bond had formed between the chemical industry and the government, specifically the Department of Agriculture, which meant Carson would be challenging multiple powerful organizations. "I think you know how grim this struggle with the U.S. government and the whole chemical industry is bound to be," warned one of her contacts. Despite the overwhelming odds, Carson was not deterred. She was determined to finish her book, no matter the cost.
Once she got a hold of the topic, it inflamed her interest and her anger, and so she was really driven to write it and finish it.
By the time Carson's book was completed, she had compiled over 300 academic reports, statistics, and personal anecdotes, all while enduring painful treatment for cancer. In June 1962, the first excerpts from her new book, Silent Spring, were published in The New Yorker. In it, Carson claimed that by indiscriminately spraying dangerous chemicals, people were upsetting the balance of nature and putting their own existence at risk.
What Carson believed in was an ecological or biocentric view of the relationship, that humans were part of nature and had to learn to live in and with nature without violently disturbing it.
Carson also warned that the overuse of pesticides would slowly render them ineffective. By killing off the weak and leaving the strong, she argued, man was not destroying the insect, but instead aiding its evolutionary advancement. Pesticide companies were outraged. They dismissed Carson's evidence as falsehoods and accused her of being hysterical, unscientific, and disloyal. One company, Velsicol, wrote a letter to Houghton Mifflin threatening to sue. Spokesmen for the chemical industries attempted to discredit Carson's claims.
The major claims in Miss Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, are gross distortions of the actual facts, completely unsupported by scientific experimental evidence and general practical experience in the field.
A particularly common argument was that Carson was nothing more than a hysterical woman and should not be trusted with matters concerning science.
They had a phrase which was very common, and they would call us little old ladies in tennis shoes.
However, despite the wave of complaints stemming from the chemical industry, the vast majority of the population took much more kindly to Carson's book. Many were shocked by its contents, having never encountered such a problem, while others, who had seen the effects firsthand, realized that the problem was much larger than they thought it was. By August, the controversy over Silent Spring had reached the Capitol. A committee was set up to review all federal policies on pesticides, and on May 15, 1963, the President's Science Advisory Committee published a report on pesticide use. In a tribute to Rachel Carson, they admitted that until the publication of Silent Spring, people were generally unaware of the toxicity of pesticides. A special CBS report was also aired in the spring of 1963, in which Carson was able to answer her critics.
It is not my contention that chemical insecticides must never be used. I do contend that we have put poisonous and biologically potent chemicals indiscriminately into the hands of persons largely or wholly ignorant of their potentials for harm.
Though she eloquently defended herself in front of the cameras, Carson was slowly losing the fight against breast cancer, and on April 14, 1964, Rachel Carson died at age 56. After Carson's death, however, the newly budding environmentalist movement did not lose traction. Within 3 years of her death, the Environmental Defense Fund was formed. Then, in 1970, President Nixon created the EPA for the purpose of protecting human health and the environment. Many other legislative acts followed, including the Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, and Toxic Substances Control Act. By 1975, every one of the toxic chemicals named in Silent Spring was either banned or severely restricted in the United States. On top of that, the environmental awareness she had raised impacts many issues outside of the environment.
It's been good for the economy, driving toward a cleaner economy, because if you can't use the resources of planet Earth wisely and cleanly, there's not going to be any economy.
Perhaps most importantly was the attitude change that followed Silent Spring. Carson's book had raised questions about the merits of trying to control nature. By emphasizing that humans were not actually separate from the environment, but part of a complex, interconnected ecosystem, she forever changed how people treated the world around them. Today, over 50 years later, the environmental movement is still alive and active. Just a few weeks ago, when the Trump administration announced that the United States would no longer be a part of the Paris Climate Agreement, civilians and legislators alike vowed to continue to protect the environment. From her start as a passionate naturalist to her most acclaimed work, Carson was a fighter. She stood against overwhelming difficulties, never wavering in her quest to defend mankind from itself. Determined and steadfast, she became the mother of the modern American environmental movement and an inspiration for many generations to come. We stand now where two roads diverge, but unlike the roads in Robert Frost's familiar poem, they are not equally fair. The road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. The other fork in the road, the one less traveled by, offers our last, our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth.
If you visit American City, you will find it very pretty. Just two things of which you must beware. Don't drink the water and don't breathe the air. Pollution, pollution.